Good morning, everybody. My name is Marion, and I'm from Team Lex Innocentium, and I get the great pleasure to welcome you all here this morning. We're very grateful to our speakers for being here and our learned chairpersons. For those of you who don't know Lex Innocentium, we're based on an ancient Irish law written by Adofnan, an Irish monk, in the year 697 AD. In his beautiful humanitarian law, Lex Innocentium, the law of the innocent, Adofnan declared it a crime to kill women and children in war, the first ever Geneva Convention. You can find out more about the law and the history of the law on our website, and you can sign the law on our website if you wish. There's also a QR code if you'd like to make a donation to the running costs. The story has it that Adofnan was inspired to write his law because of an experience he'd had some years earlier. When travelling with his mother Ronat, they came upon the bodies of a young mother and her infant child, both slain in a terrible battle. The artist Anne McKenna has created this scene for us in her beautiful painting, Adofnan and Ronat Bear Witness. Ronat's plaits falling down towards the mother and baby represent her tears and ours, and the red hair of the dead mother represents the blood that was spilt on that terrible day. Pope Leo, in a very scholarly speech just recently, tells us that rediscovering the meaning of words is perhaps one of the primary challenges of our time. He said that language is becoming more and more a weapon with which to deceive or to strike and offend opponents. Lewis Carroll shows the same awareness of the vagaries and trickeries of language, as Humpty Dumpty explains to Alice. When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And we all know about that. How do we know, for example, if it's unprovoked or preemptive? Or when is it a war of aggression or defence, or genocide or defence? To me, they all just mean dropping bombs on people and killing them. There are magic words too that our government has been dropping on us to frighten, cajole and embarrass us into joining the sleepwalk to war and the shameful waste of money and resources on war. Words that sound good, things we ought to be: responsible, accountable, ambitious and independent. But responsible and accountable for what exactly? Ambitious to do what exactly? And independent? Joining military alliances who are already so obviously hell-bent on going to war, instead of staying with the UN, where we can decide ourselves whether or not to go on their mandated missions. We've been told by other countries outside Ireland that we're piggybacking on their massive collections of deadly weapons, their willingness to go to war, and their aggression, to promote our foreign policy of friendly, cooperative relations amongst nations and the pacific resolution of international conflicts through international arbitration, piggybacking on weapons, aggressive posturing and violence to make friends, to make peace. Curiouser and curiouser. Maybe in this new bendy language, coalition of the willing actually means parcel of rogues. After all, we're now living in a world where agreement means buy time while we procure more weapons, and negotiations means distract them while we plan our attack. In such a confusing and utterly unreliable world, neutrality looks like our best option. We've been told we're not living in the real world. I'm not strange, weird, off, nor crazy, said the Cheshire Cat. My reality is just different from yours. Well, I don't like their reality. That's not a world in which I choose to live. Alice and Humpty Dumpty were actually discussing the meaning of the word impenetrability. I know what that means. Our government has shown remarkable impenetrability when it comes to the wishes of the people. So let's speak plainly today, and let's not get pulled down any rabbit holes. And let's remember too that we're here as people of peace. So we will accommodate differences in opinion, and like Alice, we will do our best to be polite and mannerly at all times.
So we're 1 week now into the latest illegal US-Israeli war on Iran. And we've seen our government here, the Dublin government, floundering in their inability and unwillingness to call this what it is, an illegal war. Helen McEntee said last Sunday, a week ago, when asked about this, that she can't say if it's illegal. And there's perhaps more truth in what she said about can't say, and we'll come to that. And of course, last night we saw the attacks by Israel on UNIFIL forces in southern Lebanon as part of their plan to use the illegal war that they're waging with the US on Iran as cover for their expansion, and to extend their occupation into southern Lebanon, as they've wanted to do and tried to do over decades. And we've seen the farcical efforts that the government have gone to, Helen McEntee and Micheál Martin, with their strained, acrobatic avoidance of mentioning who committed the attacks that they condemned, whilst then going on to spend paragraphs condemning the government in Iran and Hezbollah, as if it was them. So why can't the Irish government call out this illegal war in Iran? Why can't it note that it was Israel that committed the attacks on UNIFIL forces, of which Irish peacekeepers, of course, are part? And why can't they say it was Israel? And what does this tell us about Irish foreign policy? So in the next 40 minutes, Paddy and I hope to explain why this is the case. And it seems to us that clear structural historical analysis is needed to understand how Ireland's policy positions sit within broader shifts within what we might call the world system, both geopolitically and economically. However, it's important before we get to that to underline first what is at stake in the government's stance on this illegal war in Iran and the wider foreign policy machinations of the government at the minute, of which the question of neutrality is central. So some context here is needed, and a lot of what we'll be doing is various onion peel layers of contextualization here. So the US is currently leading a project to undermine international law and the United Nations, specifically with very targeted attacks in the United Nations. I have a long list of them here. I won't mention them all, but just in this year alone, an illegal war in Iran murdered the head of state, an illegal war in Venezuela kidnapped the head of state, an illegal blockade and enforced starvation of Cuba, threats to Greenland, Colombia and Mexico, and announced an expanding war on drugs in Latin America. And I believe that the United States Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, absolute psychopath, a cartoonish villain, is having a meeting of right-wing leaders from Latin America today to talk about expanding the war on drugs. And of course, the ongoing complicity behind the genocide in Gaza and the establishment of the so-called Board of Peace, which is essentially a private company of which Donald Trump is the director and will remain so even after he's not president, which is to replace the United Nations. And of course, there's no Palestinian representatives on this. And this is at the same time as they're withdrawing funding from 66 international organisations, 31 of them United Nations organisations. Again, this is all this year, and threatening to defund the United Nations, the United States being the biggest funder of it. And last week, defunded the International Fund for Ireland, a 40-year-old body that has been a huge role in the peace process in the North. Now, there's critiques to be had of the International Fund for Ireland, but we're seeing on our own island and our own peace process, of which Fianna Fáil particularly see themselves as guardians, divesting from this. Right? And this comes in, of course, this is just this year. Right? The Irish government's 2025 Defence Amendment Bill would see the Irish state participate in this undermining of the United Nations and international law by seeking to remove the triple lock, i.e. by removing international law and United Nations from the core of Irish foreign policy. The government's plan to remove the triple lock is designed to allow Irish troops to take part in EU and NATO-led military missions without United Nations authority and hence arguably outside the boundaries of international law. The Irish government, like its European allies, of course presents this as furthering the interests of peace, but this is peace washing if there ever was it, which presents war as peace. And this is the same corruption of language, of meaning, of reason that presents aggression as defence, and that Marion has started with today. We're seeing the evacuation of meaning out of our political language. To be clear, the United Nations is the only organisation with the authority to make decisions on questions of international peacekeeping. If peacekeeping or peace enforcement, different under the United Nations Charter, are pursued outside the structures of the United Nations or without its sanction, then they do not take place within international law. The Irish government suggests that it would take part in a peace enforcement mission to Ukraine as part of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, very Iraq vibes there, if there is a ceasefire. Yet, just over 1 week ago, Micheál Martin announced that Ireland is militarily aligned with Ukraine. If that is the case, and Ireland is militarily aligned with Ukraine, then Ireland cannot be impartial to that conflict, a requirement, one of the 3 requirements for UN peacekeeping missions, but would rather be a combatant in the conflict. So what's being presented as peacekeeping is in fact the overseeing of a frozen conflict by a combatant. That's the legality of this, right? So Ireland has long played a role in UN peacekeeping, including, of course, in UNIFIL, precisely because neutrality has meant the state has been impartial within international conflicts and has been respected as such, and hence why it's played such an important role in those UN peacekeeping missions. So the Irish government, in keeping with the direction of the US and Europe's NATO powers, wants to decentre the United Nations in international affairs and engage in military missions outside the framework of international law. That is what is at stake in this discussion about the triple lock. It's not about a veto from China and Russia, it's about Ireland participating in military missions outside the structures of the United Nations and international law. Yet the question remains as to why the government wants to pursue this course of action when neutrality has served the country well since its inception and when it enjoys such intense popularity amongst the public who voted for the triple lock in 2 referendums in support of the Nice and Lisbon treaties. How do we explain this apparent sudden shift in government policy, and why now? Indeed, it's important to understand that this shift in policy has a longer history and emerges from longer-term dynamics that are often not very visible to the public or involve different aspects of governance that are usually framed as distinct from one another. It's clear, I'm sure, to most of us here that Irish foreign policy is constrained by the interests of the United States as well as those of the European Union and Britain. There's perhaps no clearer example of this than the Occupied Territories Bill, passed in 2019 with the full support of all parties in the Dáil, including Fianna Fáil, bar Fine Gael, but which successive governments have refused to pass into law since, despite intense pressure from the public and from opposition parties. The US ambassador to Ireland, as well as the US ambassador to Israel, and a number of US congressional representatives and senators have publicly warned that Ireland passing the OTB would have economic and trade consequences for Ireland, with the presence of US tech companies mentioned explicitly. And that's what's said in public. Here we see direct pressure being exerted by the United States to curtail and limit Irish foreign policy choices, even when they enjoy deep cross-party and mass public support. It is unclear if threats have been issued to the government from the US behind closed doors about the invasion of Iran, but it is clear that there's fear of reprisals from the United States, and this ensures that the government are refusing to condemn this illegal war in Iran and cannot even identify it as illegal.
A story that we are often told about Ireland's sort of modernisation and development goes back to the sort of 50s and 60s, figures like T.K. Whitaker, the Taoiseach Sean Lamass, and this moment where we sort of pivoted very rapidly from a protectionist economy, which in the 30s and 40s and 50s had been about trying to develop indigenous industry, to use our national resources like peat, think about ESB, think about housing programs, which obviously didn't solve the very sort of chronic and deep underdevelopment of the Irish economy, an economy that had been inherited, that had been underdeveloped through colonial times. So in the 50s or 60s, there was this pivot away from that strategy towards a more open economy, towards this strategy of industrialization by invitation. So rather than developing our own industries, we would try to attract foreign industries, particularly US industries, to locate here, to set up, and then to export their goods. And this would be how we would develop. And the narrative is, or the story is, that this has been incredibly successful, and by many indicators it has been. But there are parts of that story that are not always told, and it's these parts of the story that I just want to sort of focus on, and that may help us get up to the present. So this idea that there were enlightened civil servants and politicians who saw these problems in a protectionist economy and made these enlightened decisions to shift us away from that, disregard or underplay the external pressure that was being put on Ireland at this time. So this is in the 40s, in fact, straight after World War II and into the 50s and 60s. Namely from the US. So after World War II, in the context of shifts in the world system, we see the US becoming the world hegemon. And in particular, their role in Europe was to rebuild this war-ravaged Europe, largely as a bulwark against the spread of communism. So the Marshall Plan and the Soviet Union. So the Marshall Plan was about investment in European economy, European countries, in order to build up their industries, but in order to also make them subordinate somewhat to the US. And in Ireland, that also played out. So Ireland was initially excluded from Marshall aid, but then we were given allocation in the form of loans. So not aid, but loans. And with those loans, there were conditions, as there are always conditions on loans. And those conditions were that Ireland would end protectionism, that we would move to integrate into what would become the OECD, which is this largely transatlantic sort of economic arrangement, and that we would create the enabling conditions for specifically US industries to locate here. Allied to that was that Ireland would grant access into European markets. So this is going hand in hand with Ireland entering into the EC eventually in 1973. But the idea was that US industries could locate in Ireland, produce goods, and then sell them into the European markets, because at that time in particular there was tariffs. So this isn't to say that was necessarily the driving force, but these were dynamics that were setting the scene, or setting the sort of the foundation for the development of Ireland's FDI economy. So it didn't work for 20 years, which is an important thing to say. This model of FDI-led development, or industrialization via invitation, did not work. So in 1982, there was the famous Telesis report, which said that it wasn't working. It was not improving our GDP, it wasn't improving various development indicators. And so what happened? 1980s is a key decade. 1986, the IFSC sets up the International Financial Services Centre. Ireland becomes a key hub in the development of a more financialized world system. And this is about corporation tax, and Ireland basically playing a role for the channeling of profits made from global activities through Ireland, and we take a cut. So that was one part of the story. But the other part of the story that isn't really talked that much about is 1989, when Intel arrived to Ireland. And Intel was a huge coup for the IDA, the Industrial Development Authority. Up until that point, we hadn't had such a big investment. And the key thing about Intel's investment in Leixlip was that it provided a template, really a template for further sort of provision of infrastructure for foreign direct investment. So Intel, if you don't know that facility out there, it's on a large parcel of land. It requires a huge amount of electricity, energy, and it also requires a huge amount of water. So what we start to see, and this is what Pat and I write a lot about in our book, From the Bog to the Cloud, is that the development model, which is about attracting FDI, is not just about corporation tax. It's also about providing infrastructure and resources for FDI. And if we fast forward from Intel in 1989, we have the Celtic Tiger, that development, to after the crash, we see this really ramping up with data centers. So we already have a kind of a well-established tech sector here. Their headquarters are based here. But from about 2013 onwards, you see a massive growth in data centers located in Ireland, to the extent that today, the forecast is by the end of the decade, maybe 30% of electricity on the grid will be used by data centers. So this is an enormous, enormous figure, which can only really be explained by some of this history that I'm trying to lay out. So some of the figures here, in the last decade, corporation tax has gone from 4 billion to 26 billion. 3 US companies provide 46% of that. Eli Lilly, a pharmaceuticals company, Apple and Microsoft, 2 tech companies. That means that 3 companies provide about 12% of the total tax take in Ireland. So these figures become a little bit like, oh, they're quite abstract, they're big. What they mean is that Ireland is effectively one of the most dependent economies in the world. There are very few other national economies that are as dependent on another national economy and their industries than Ireland is on the US. And the significance of that is not just that we rely on these companies and we rely on the policies of that country, the US, but that this reliance or dependence is a relationship of power. It's not just an economic relationship, it's a political relationship. And in a context like now, where there are all of these geopolitical maneuverings, illegal wars and so on, this is becoming much more visible. It's becoming much more clear to us in the kinds of statements or lack of statements that we see our government making. And the importance of all of this is that it's not just about the politicians in government today. Why this analysis, why we're trying to look at the structural features of our economy and how it gives rise to this dependency. Because you could get rid of the politicians, you could get rid of Fianna Fáil, but these structural conditions are still there. So we need to understand what the kind of driving forces or the root causes of this type of subservience or subordination to the US in this case, where that's coming from, so that we can be clear-sighted about how we challenge that and also how we think about connecting up different struggles.
The Dublin government, the state here, is faced with a situation where its economy is extraordinarily dependent on investment from another state, the United States. The country that Ireland is extraordinarily economically dependent upon is becoming increasingly more volatile and aggressive. So what does the state do when faced with that circumstance? Does it take a pathway of delinking or decoupling the economies? Does it seek to pluralise economic relationships? A little bit. I was happy to see Mia Martin in China in January, trying to do that. Does it support local industry and to try and build alternative bases here? For example, having a better land use, particularly in rural environments. It does not do those things. It decides to push to secure and expand US FDI, and it seeks to deepen dependency. Right? And I think that's crucial to understand. The government are aware that the United States is becoming more volatile and aggressive. They are aware, very aware, that Ireland is locked into this dependency, and the response to it is more dependency. That is the logic, right, that drives all of this. So our argument here is not simply that we need to understand the transformations underway in Irish foreign policy as bound up with the state's economic dependency on the United States FDI, although this is clearly necessary, but that the government's embrace of militarisation is now a central part of that attempt to deepen the dependency. It's one of the avenues through which it seeks to deepen dependency. In brief, we argue that the state is attempting to turn Ireland into a hub for the development of interlinked energy and technology infrastructures in order to fix and expand US capital investment and ensure the continuity of its current model of economic development. So what are we referring to when we talk about these interlinked energy and technology infrastructures? So Paddy has already mentioned the presence of Intel since the late 1980s, which for a long time was the only high-grade microchip manufacturer in Europe. It is now being kind of outpaced, and it's almost like they're low-quality microchips compared to those produced in Taiwan and so on. And there's plans now to expand microchip production in other parts of Europe, including Germany and so on, in order to kind of on-source, as it gets referred to, microchip production. But of course, Ireland, as I'm sure you well know, and it's funny for me to be the one talking about this, given that Paddy is the expert on it, but this is the way the cookie fell. But data centres. Data centres are at the core of this. And data centres are used principally by the so-called hyperscalers, who we hear a lot about in Ireland, including our tax dependency, Google, Amazon, Meta and Microsoft, who use those data for cloud computing, particularly as they expand into the AI economy, which involves huge amounts of cloud computing, and we're told that the AI economy will lie, and AI technologies will lie at the core of the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and Ireland is trying to position itself as being a beneficiary of this. And of course, all those data center and cloud computing and digital communications rely on these systems of connection, networks of connection. And this is where we have frequent mention to the subsea cables, right, which are networks of fiber optic cables that span the world. There's 500 of them around globally. These are owned largely by tech companies, including Google, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, who've massively invested in owning those infrastructures themselves. There's about 4 or 5 of them from North America that come to Ireland. There's 11 that are in or near Irish waters, so they're not often in Irish waters, but we're told that we're responsible for them. And there's 10 that go between UK, France and Iceland and Ireland. And I'm a little hazy on those numbers, only because the information isn't quite available. There is plans to expand those, and those are being expanded. But basically, we have about 4 to North America and 10 to Britain, France and Iceland. And we're told this is the be-all and end-all of those connections, right? And if the data centers and the subsea cables that serve them and the microchip manufacturer is the kind of tech infrastructure, on the other side we have these energy infrastructures. And here we're not talking just about kind of renewable energies replacing fossil fuels, but rather entering into a new relationship of coupling or supplementing fossil fuels, where wind and green energy come together in order to provision these data centers, right? And with marine wind, we hear a lot about this. I'm sure many people who are involved in environmental work are also hearing a lot about this in Ireland. Ireland being promoted for over a decade now by the government as the Saudi Arabia of wind. It's going to be this massive frontier of green energy expansion into the sea, which hasn't been forthcoming yet, in part because the government won't invest in it. They just try and make tax breaks, and the risks are too high for investment to flow without that state intervention. And we see this in Britain, Netherlands and so on as well. So, and this is part of repackaging Ireland as this enormous maritime territory, not just a little island with small territory, but this vast maritime territorial space that is open for business, but is also then subject to risks. And of course, we also see the expansion of gas pipelines bringing in fossil fuels. 2 pipelines already exist, of course, from Britain, bringing most of the gas, and all the gas, to Ireland, which is our main source of energy here still. But we also see the plan to put a liquid natural gas terminal to import natural gas from the United States and Canada via the United States into North Kerry, the so-called Shannon LNG project, which has been in planning controversy for over a decade. It has been rejected, and the government have overridden the planning board to say that this will go ahead as a strategic energy investment. And we're also seeing discussion now of a second LNG port in Clare to be a strategic reserve of gas in case of energy crises. Right? So the two of these expanding networks of infrastructural investment are tied together. Right? We have the data centers, the subsea cables, the marine wind energy and liquid natural gas terminals being brought together, the energy to serve the data centers to serve the function of fixing US capital here to keep our FDI dependency going. And of course we know that data centers are incredibly energy intensive. They're already using over 25% of the electricity used in Ireland goes to data centers, and that's expected to be 30% or over by 2030. And hence the expansion of these energy infrastructures to provision that. These energy and technology infrastructures, both existing and proposed, are increasingly being framed by other states, by military blocs, by think tank experts and industry lobbyists as being at risk from attack, and as such they require protection. This in turn requires the Irish state to increase military spending and to become further integrated into military alliances with the EU, NATO and other regional bodies, as well of course as Britain, to ensure the protection of these corporate infrastructures. Crucial here is that Ireland's failure or lack of capacity to protect these infrastructures is framed as a threat to Britain, to the EU, to NATO, rather than Ireland itself. But threats to Ireland are increasingly framed as being threats to these corporate infrastructures. In essence, then, we argue that the Irish state's plan to militarise FDI, investing in defence spending and integrating into military alliances in order to protect the energy and technology infrastructure that the state wants to expand to maintain and deepen economic dependency on US FDI. Hence, the expansion of infrastructure investment to support US investment in Ireland is converging with the demands for militarisation on the state coming from the EU, Britain and NATO. This is the context within the government announced just a week ago or 10 days ago the first maritime security strategy, which involves all sorts of plans for building UK, French NATO bases in Ireland, even the former head of the Green Party, Eamon Ryan, talking about turning Dunleary Pier into a military base. He's on some journey, as are Eamon. So to put this a little bit more bluntly, the state is seeking to deepen dependency on the US tech and fossil fuel corporations by building targets that require, one, investing public money to protect these infrastructures, money, of course, that goes into the hands of international arms companies, and two, giving up neutrality and foreign policy independence, which makes us more vulnerable to other countries' enemies. We are being put at risk, and we're being made to pay for it. This is a perverse sort of protection racket. The policy of militarising FDI represents a huge transfer of public money from social need, housing, health, mental health, basic services, climate resilience into private hands, particularly the international arms trade. But it is not only being presented as necessary, a cost that a mature nation must be willing to meet its responsibilities and its allies, to Britain, EU and NATO, but some are even arguing that it's an exciting opportunity for investment. Hence we now have think tanks and business lobby groups arguing that investing in national security will be a win for business and help to support indigenous dual-use economy. See the recent report by the IIEA and Deloitte published in December, Secure Together, enhancing Ireland's security and resilience in a time of heightened geopolitical risk. And I should mention that the IIEA, they're very close to the government. They're basically the in-house Europhile government think tank, headed by Dan O'Brien, who is never off our airwaves. He's on Saturday and Sunday morning most mornings. And Dan O'Brien is, I would say, an ideological extremist who is presented as, and often makes completely baseless claims, but is presented as a sensible voice, mature voice that we should be all following.
I think a lot in this context, or a line that comes up a lot, is Raymond Williams has this line from an essay, I can't remember the title of it, in the 80s I think it was, in the context of his CND work and anti-war work, which was, to build peace now more than ever, we need to build more than peace. And I think most of us are probably here and through Lex because of our concerns about war, militarism, and our desire for peace. But in a way, the argument that we're trying to make is that it's more than peace. It's about our economic model and this dependency on the US and the types of contradictions that gives rise to in all sorts of ways. And so what we need to do is use that analysis to identify where there are cracks in that system or that structure, to try to connect those cracks and to try to amplify those cracks. So we need to see what links our concerns, our campaigns here around peace and anti-war with campaigns which are against Shannon LNG, data centres, rising cost of living. And I think key to that, and we are in this moment where things are happening quickly, but there is a lot in the air. There are a lot, these contradictions are becoming more apparent to a lot of people. And it's our job to try to, as I say, sort of deepen those. And key to that is about questioning this model of our FDI-led development. And so we are told very often that if it wasn't for FDI, we would effectively sink into the Atlantic. There is this existential sort of ideology around it. And I don't want to stand here and say that Ireland hasn't become a very wealthy country on the back of particularly corporation tax. But what we can ask, this is a more pointed question, is who benefits from that model and who carries the costs of that model? And if we ask those questions, we can start to be a little bit more precise and a little bit more critical. So as building on what Rory said, if we just think about the infrastructures, so we know the amount of resources that are being devoted, and this is going back 30, 40 years, to building infrastructures for FDI. So whether that was Intel or whether that's now data centers for the tech industry or subsea cables. But it isn't just the physical infrastructures. It is the energy the state puts into the regulatory context, the planning context, to make these things happen. So, for example, with data centers, laws are imminently about to be changed, the Private Wires Bill, which will allow large energy generators directly connect to data centers, which is a reversal of energy legislation since 1927 when ESB was set up, a way to bypass the public grid. That requires enormous energy on the part of the state to make that happen. It's not necessarily just buying grid infrastructure. It's the resources they're willing to put in to making these things more conditions more enabling for the tech industry. At the same time, we see record homelessness. We see cost of living going up, which will only become massively accelerated because of the US-Israeli war on Iran. Already we're seeing that with energy prices going up. Cost of food will follow very quickly. So here we have a situation where in December it was announced that 300,000 homes are in arrears for energy bills. And they are now going to be put under more stress because of US-Israeli aggression in West Asia and the Middle East. So there is a direct connection here with people's cost of living with these wars. That is a connection that we can drive home and that we can push. So in a kind of a blunt way, or as a line, I mean, I guess it's summed up in the kind of welfare or warfare to welfare, is that instead of investing in public housing, renewable energy, retrofitting, climate adaptation to make us protected against flooding, the state is investing in LNG, fossil fuel infrastructure, AI, and arms. So on the one hand, you have investments which would directly, tangibly make people's lives more secure. And on the other hand, you have investments and energy being put into things that will make our lives, not just in Ireland, but in the world, immeasurably less secure. And that is an argument or a line that we need to be hailing from the rooftops and trying to stitch together anti-war, climate justice, anti-poverty, housing, international solidarity, stitching together these communities and these campaigns into more of a mass coalition or a mass movement. And that work is very difficult. I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, this is easy. But there are some inklings of where that has happened very recently. And in particular, I'm thinking about the Catherine Connolly campaign, which I think really built off a strength that we have, which we really shouldn't take for granted, which is the popular support for neutrality on the island. So poll after poll, despite the relentless media campaigns from the government, is still very, very high. So the Irish Times poll in February, 71% of people polled said that they wanted neutrality enshrined in the Constitution. It's a massive thing, which we can't take for granted, but we can build off that. Catherine Connolly's campaign built off that. And I'm just going to finish with a quote from her inauguration speech, because, I mean, I'm sure many of you listened to that speech and it got the hairs on the back of your neck, and so it's always worth returning to it. But I think it is helpful for us in the context of what we're doing here today. So she said, "Against those who said ideas were too far out, too left, at odds with the prevailing narrative, we saw, through conversations around the country, which is important, rural and urban, the emergence of hope, the emergence of joy, along with the courage and determination of people to use their voices to shape a country that we can be proud of."
Hello, Professor Sykes. My name is John Maguire. I'm involved in chairing some sessions, and I have the privilege of introducing you. I think people know of your brilliant career as an economist at Columbia, your work with the Center for Sustainable Development, and so many other interventions. We're fascinated. As you know, our conference is very much directed towards what can a small country do, like Ireland, in the world, the way you eloquently describe it. How can we maintain our policy of neutrality, particularly under pressures like the threatened abolition of the triple lock? And I'm particularly happy to connect with you, and I'll simply finish by saying this, because one of my treasures is a well-thumbed copy of your book, To Move the World, JFK's quest for peace. And I keep going back to it for an astonishing fact that never enters into our debates. In the year in which JFK made the so-called flagship visit to Ireland, 1963, as you point out, he made the American University speech where he effectively called off the Cold War, and he spoke in the UN, which he respected hugely, and he spoke proudly about his achievement of neutrality for Laos. Unfortunately, he wasn't to live to develop those policies. But given that those are in the background for an Irish person reading your wonderful book and greeting you, we'd love to hear about your visit to Ireland and what you want to say to this small country. Thank you.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for wonderful hospitality. We, of course, loved being in Dublin. We loved meeting President Connolly. We loved being at UCD. We love being at Trinity. I very much liked being at RTE, even though it was a little argumentative. And I would always wish we had more time to discuss things. But it was a wonderful visit, and we're really grateful. And of course, it was a visit at a moment of a kind of supreme madness. We are so dangerously and badly led in the United States right now that either we're on the brink of World War III or we're already in World War III. History will judge, but we've never had a president as mentally unstable as Trump. He's psychologically unhinged and at the top of power that is, of course, immense. And just before I got on, I saw that he made a threat, another one. I haven't read it, just I saw the news clip on my feed, which said that if Iran does not unconditionally surrender, it will be completely destroyed. This is madness that we have not heard since Hitler. The language, the venom, the psychopathy is all there, plain as can be. It's normalized, unfortunately, in the European Union. I'm sad to say. Van der Leyen would say, yeah, he's our ally. Merz would say, I'm all on board. Macron would say, have some nuclear weapons. Starmer would say, let's go at it. It's a kind of insanity, that a double insanity. I think psychiatrists call it folie à deux, which is we have a mad leader in the United States and Europe completely plays along. Maybe it's as delusional, these leaders, not Irish leaders, but the ones that I mentioned. But it's unbelievable that this is normalized, that we don't have every moment the Taoiseach and others saying, you can't talk that way, the world will blow up. But rather, we stand with America. We stand against Iran. To tell you how completely weird it is, a week ago at the UN Security Council, I was there last Sunday. I was invited by several governments, including Iran, to speak to the Security Council. But Britain and the United States blocked my speaking. So I did not speak. I just sat in the audience because the chair was Britain. The British are imperial to the last moment. They cannot get over their imperialism. And it's just awful. They taught America everything. Actually, America's so crazy you can't believe it, but Britain's even more crazy because they do it all the same way. They don't have an empire anymore, but they still think they do, so they behave that way. In any event, they didn't let me speak, so I listened. and every European speaker on the day that Iran was attacked, brazenly, vulgarly, profoundly dangerously by Israel and the United States, every European speaker took the floor to attack Iran. Not one of them mentioned that the United States and Israel had attacked Iran. Not one of them mentioned that they had violated in the most profound way the UN Charter. They all talked about Iran, provocation, Iran, I should say, unprovoked attack on its neighbors. It was bizarre. Orwell, if he had written it, it would have looked beyond Orwellian. But that's how it actually was. How it actually was. And this is, to this moment, how we are. We are normalizing insanity and normalizing World War III. The facts are rather straightforward, if I could just briefly say. Iran has tried for 15 years to negotiate with the United States. An agreement was signed in 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, in which Iran said, we don't want nuclear weapons. It's against our religious principles. We put ourselves under the inspection regime of the United Nations, International Atomic Energy Agency, and you remove the sanctions because we need to survive. That agreement was signed by the P5+1, meaning the US, Britain, France, China, Russia, and Germany. And then it was unanimously ratified by the UN Security Council. Inside the United States, it was heatedly opposed by the Zionist lobby, the pro-Israel lobby. And when Trump came to power, he ripped up the agreement under the weight of the lobby. The lobby by itself is a complicated thing. It's partly Israel led, and it's partly Christian Zionism in the United States, which is evangelical, Protestant, biblical literalism. It's a very strange theology, I have to tell you. Really weird. I've delved into it a bit. We don't have time to talk about premillennial dispensationalism of the book of Revelation. We don't have time to talk about Huckabee, our ambassador, saying last week that Israel has the right to the lands between the Nile and the Euphrates. But this is not a tiny part of the American story. It's Huckabee, it seems to be Hegseth, it seems to be Trump's base. Whatever it is, the U.S. ripped up the JCPOA. Then it proceeded to assassinate, together with Mossad, Iranian leaders. It attacked the nuclear sites. And then in the last year, twice during supposed negotiations, it bombed Iran and tried to assassinate the negotiators. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not normal behavior. This is not normal. The fact that then Europe stands up and cheers is also not normal. So this is really where we are. What's going on? Well, I think we should acknowledge three basic points quickly. And I know I don't have much time and I don't want to hold you for long, but there are three basic points. First, the American deep state, which means the CIA and the Pentagon and what we used to call the military-industrial complex, and I call it the military-industrial digital complex because it includes Silicon Valley now, has a long-standing fundamental view of American hegemony. So this is the basic driver. In polite company, it's called the American-led rules-based order. Never was there a greater oxymoron than that. The only rule is power. It's a long-standing project. It goes back to 1945. Remember that Winston Churchill, even as the ashes were still smoldering in Berlin, asked his war cabinet about invading the Soviet Union, Operation Unthinkable. This goes back to 1945, that there should be, Churchill thought it should be Anglo-American hegemony. Americans thought it should be American hegemony. The British think that they somehow run by hypnosis America. Whatever it is, the idea is that it should be hegemony for the world. That's one strand. A second strand is Israel. Israel is the most violent nation in the world per capita. There are only 10 million, but if they had their way, there'd be war, and there has been war across the Middle East. Mind you, I speak as an American Jew. I want to be understood. What Israel is doing is repulsive. It is violent. It is primitive. Sorry, this is not about anti-Semitism or anything else. This is just nonstop war. And there are two strands to it. One strand is a kind of ruthless belief that Israel's security can only come through Israel's regional hegemony. So that's a kind of security argument, but taken to, again, a madness, because they don't know how to talk to their own neighbors. I know it. I've lived through this for 50 years. They do not accept any diplomacy at all. I speak to Arab leaders every day, every single day. I speak to Iranian leaders, but Israel doesn't. It just kills them. That's one strand. And the second strand is, honestly, and we don't have time to go into it, part of Israel lives in the 5th century BC. They cannot distinguish between, I mean this literally, ladies and gentlemen, they cannot distinguish between the book of Joshua or the book of Esther and today. That's their guidance. It's a perversion of religion. It is a complete, twisted fundamentalism. Those two strands are Israel's strands right now. It's extremely dangerous. I detest it because of its destruction of Judaism as an ethical religion, but also it is doing such profound damage to the world that it's incredible. But it doesn't stop because of the power within the United States. And the US sees this as a part of the US hegemony. And the other part of this is that it's all part of a war against China, which is another madness. The US idea is we must take on and destroy or contain or bring to their knees any large rival. This is what we learned from Britain. Britain is a country that hated any large rival. And one of them was Russia. So British Russophobia started around 1840. It never relented. And this is true until today. So these are the motivating factors. The US is trying to assure what it regards as global hegemony, and Israel regional hegemony. And then I was going to say the third factor, I lost my train of thought. The third factor is Trump as a joker card in this thing. Nobody should have a president like Trump. Period. Ever. Not in Ireland, not in a city government, not as a mayor, not as a world wannabe hegemon. He is psychologically impaired. period. That's serious, ladies and gentlemen. He is a malignant narcissist. He is an extreme Machiavellian. He is, in my understanding, a psychopath, meaning in a clinical sense. If you look at Hare's index ranking of psychopathy, Trump just scores at the top of the list on every criterion. So he believes kill, destroy, until you get your way. Well, we've been there before with the world destroyers. And this is where we are right now. So, friends, Ireland, you're a wonderful, wonderful country that gave us our finest president, John F. Kennedy. You know, he came from New Ross indirectly, as you know, and he believed in peace. And I think it's overwhelmingly likely that the CIA killed him precisely for that reason. He understood how to make peace, and thank you for referring to his peace speech and his speech to the Dow. And I'll just close on that, because what he said in the Dow is so incredibly important and valuable for us today and guidance for Ireland. So first, one of the things he said was, and I quote, "The major forum for your nation's greater role in world affairs is that of protector of the weak and voice of the small, the United Nations. From Cork to the Congo, from Galway to Gaza Strip," that's 1963, Gaza Strip. "From this legislative assembly, the Dáil, to the United Nations, Ireland is sending its most talented men to do the world's most important work, the work of peace. The message is for Ireland, be the great defender of the UN. Be the great defender of the UN. Your ambassador to the UN in 2015, David Donoghue, brought to the world the Sustainable Development Goals. I was lucky and privileged and delighted to be with him in the last 3 days together. He's a wonderful person. Your diplomats are wonderful people. Don't fall into the folie à deux of the United States and Europe of a collective madness. Defend the UN, defend peace, defend, most importantly, Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter, which says that no nation may use force or the threat of force against another member state. This is the reason for the United Nations. Israel and the United States have gravely violated the fundamental principle of international law. Please be the champions of international law. It will make a huge difference. You will not be alone. Spain has shown very brave leadership in recent days. Help turn the European Union once again to a project of peace, not a vassalage of the United States. Thank you very much.
No one needs to gloss those words. They are wonderful. We'll try to carry them into our political life and into the day's proceedings. And we know that you have made us some of your precious time on a day when you have a tight schedule. We appreciate it hugely. You have stimulated and inspired us, and we wish you well.
That was just so good to hear Jeffrey Saxon speaking such wise words directly to us here in Ireland, and who could argue with him?
Patricia, as you know, was an MEP for the Green Party from 1994 to 2004. She is now a practicing barrister, and she has been a lifelong campaigner for peace, disarmament, human rights, and democracy. In terms of democracy, Patricia achieved a great victory for the country in her case before the Supreme Court in 1995, in which she argued successfully, now known as the McKenna Judgment, that it was unconstitutional for the Government of Ireland to spend taxpayers' money promoting only one side of the argument in referendum campaigns. This led to the setting up of the Referendum Commission. We are now, ironically, faced with another blatant, undemocratic manoeuvre by an Irish government, defying the wishes of the Irish people in both the Nice and the Lisbon Treaty referenda, who voted to maintain Ireland's triple lock with its necessity for a UN mandate for Irish troops to be sent abroad. The government now intends to dismantle the triple lock without referring back to the Irish people. And I think a great part of this meeting today, and thanks you very much, Lex, for organising it, is to see, is there any way we can stop this undemocratic move by our government? So if Patricia will speak first, but I think, shall I introduce our other speaker, Eamon O'Crieve, at the same time? You're very welcome. And Eamon, as you know, is the Fianna Fáil TD for Galway West from 1992 to 2024. Galway West, I think, has a good reputation for producing good TDs. He was a member of state Minister of State from 1997 to 2002, and a government minister from 2002 to 2011, as well as a senator from 1989 to 1992. Eamon has done a great deal of work did a great deal of work for years over the peace process in Northern Ireland, and he is still involved with that work. I know he has spoken out for Irish neutrality at different times and has been critical of moves to align Ireland with EU or NATO defence pacts. He has opposed moves to further militarise the European Union.
Yes, of course Ireland can remain neutral. While it mightn't be written in the Constitution in relation to neutrality, what is in the Constitution is very, very clear in Article 29 that we do not adhere to the idea that you bomb your way to so-called peace, that you're supposed to use international negotiation, you're supposed to negotiate and try and find a settlement without killing anybody's child, and that is what we're supposed to do. Now, I just want to, Eamon's grandfather, I'm going to quote him now because I think it's a very important quote, and this is from 1936. He says, "All small states can do, if the statesmen of the greater states fail in their duty, is resolutely to determine that they will not become the tools of any great power, and that they will resist with whatever strength they may possess every attempt to force them into a war against their will." And that is exactly what we should be doing, is following on the guidance of the late President De Valera, and we should not be doing what our own government is doing now. Now, I'll first of all say that I'm a Eurosceptic and proud, and I will not actually back away from that. I think it's very important that we retake the word Eurosceptic, and we take it from the people like Nigel Farage. Euroscepticism, I started in relation to politics from my Eurosceptic ideal, and it was to do with the militarisation of Europe and where it was going: democracy, lack of accountability and militarisation. And I think that that is gone so far, it's unbelievable. You know, the military agenda, and that is what the government want to do. They want to lift our post-colonial mentality. Leaders, they kowtow to the European Union, to America, to Britain. That's all they've ever done. Somebody they think is more superior than them. The bottom line is, and as President De Valera, the late President De Valera showed, we are superior in relation to the way we think, or the way we did think in relation to international disputes, and we should stick to that. But what Ireland wants to do, and the triple lock is a key thing, they really have to get rid of any impediment to the European Union's military agenda. And I'm focusing on the European Union. I know there are another few issues I'll touch on, but it is undeniable what's happening within the European Union. And we were called scaremongers and providing disinformation in relation to a number of issues, and I'm just going to touch on them now in a minute or two. But if you just look at the military agenda of the EU and how far it has come, you've got the Partnership for Peace with NATO. Of course, peace is always abused in relation to where the military want to go. You've got the EU battle groups. You've got the proposal recently there about in relation to seizing sovereign funds from Russia, despite the fact that it'll all reverberate on the taxpayers in this country, and the government have no right to be doing something like this. The other issues, the Nice Treaty, I'll come to that in a second, and the Lisbon Treaty. On the Nice Treaty, this is where the triple lock came in. And if you recall, there was a vote on the Nice Treaty, we rejected it, and then we got the triple lock, or the so-called Seville Declaration. And then we had a second vote. Now, Carol mentioned about the McKenna judgment. It's interesting to note that the first Nice Treaty was held with a referendum commission who were provided with the task of giving out the yes and no arguments. Before the second Nice Treaty referendum, on the eve of the Christmas recess, the government railroaded through legislation without any debate whatsoever to remove from the referendum commission the role of giving out the yes and no arguments. In other words, it's like a debate and a proposition. If you put forward, that's all the referendum commission can do is put forward the proposition, and you can't put forward a proposition without actually saying why you're putting it forward. In other words, it's indirectly justifying what the government want to do. And that's what they did with these two, and they got it through, in my opinion, illegally and unconstitutionally, because what they did was they got around the McKenna principles by allowing the referendum commission to provide a persuasive sort of argument as to why people should vote in favour. And the key issue on that was the Seville Declaration. That's the triple lock. Lisbon Treaty came again, first vote, second vote to be due, what we're told, and again that was re-endorsing the whole issue of the triple lock, and people in the second referendum voted trusting the government. The other thing I just want to mention in relation to the government, it argues that in relation to the triple lock, and this is important, it argues that, look, you've got the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and they could veto Ireland's participation in peacekeeping, and that they'd be controlling our foreign policy. Now, that is nonsense on stilts. It's quite clear. If you look, for example, in relation to what has been happening in recent times, the government has dragged its heels in relation to the Middle East. It has withdrawn its troops from Lebanon. It has failed to stand up to America and to Israel in relation to Gaza. The government has done nothing about that. And when we talk about our right to our foreign policy and our right to our policy, it's interesting to see that when it comes to the Occupied Territories Bill, the argument being made is that, oh, we can't do this because of the EU. So in other words, the government has absolutely no problem with supporting the EU, which is restricting, if they're correct in what they're saying, restricting our right to actually implement the Occupied Territories Bill. That, so it beggars belief. Which way do they want it? Do they want to be able to do something for peace, or do they not? The bottom line is, it's a misnomer to say that by getting rid of the triple lock, that Ireland will be getting involved in peacekeeping. What they will be doing is allowing Ireland to get involved in wars without a UN mandate, in wars, whether it be illegal wars, resource wars, whatever kind of wars they want, without a UN mandate. And that facilitates the European Union. Another issue in relation to what Ireland can do and that we're being stopped from doing anything. We're not. One best example is Shannon Airport. The use of Shannon by the US military, and indeed recently we saw that Shannon has been actually used to rendition people, Palestinians, captured in America and are being sent to Israel, the country that's responsible for the genocide in Gaza. And they've been renditioned through Shannon. Now we have a situation where America and Israel have gone in and attacked Iran in breach of Article 2 of the UN Charter, in breach of any international or norms of any international law. What they did was they actually were in the middle of negotiations with Iran. The Iranians were sitting down to discuss these negotiations, and they bombed them. I mean, there is no absolutely no legality for what America and Israel have done, and therefore there should be an immediate cessation of any US flights going through Shannon. There should be an immediate cessation of anything connected with Israel going through Shannon. And I believe that in relation to the European Union, there should be immediately a completely isolation of America in relation to what it's doing, and Israel for what it's doing. It's the only way ahead. Otherwise, international law has been turned on its head. We're ignoring all of the key aspects of international law. And you look at what happened in Venezuela with the Americans. Well, I knew when that happened what was going to come next. We knew that what they wanted was to get control of Venezuelan oil so that they could then go in and go for Iran. But the question here is, and they talk about regime change. Now, so nobody might like the system that's in Iran, but come here, none of us, as we're just listening to Mr. Sachs there, none of us like the regime that's in America. Does that mean that we go in and bomb them to get rid of Trump? But the thing here is, who is next? The European Union, and as it's just been pointed out, the European Union has done nothing in relation to condemning what the US and Israel have done. They did nothing. In fact, it took 2 years for Ursula von der Leyen to even criticise Israel in relation to the continuing genocide in Gaza. In relation to what's happening at the moment, there is the principle of international law. The European Union is actually doing absolutely nothing about it. And that means that who is next in relation to regime change or in relation to just going in and doing what they want? We have to say no, and the Irish government have to say no to this. They have to stand up and be counted. At least Spain is doing something in relation to trying to show a little bit of credibility in relation to what's happening. But we are doing nothing, and our government is doing nothing. So when they say that we have to get rid of the triple lock because we want to do something that's going to be positive, that we support, it's absolutely, totally lies. That's, to put it bluntly, that's what it is. And we have to call them out on that. Now, the European Union, as I said, there are so many different things going on. One of the things is just in relation to the abuse of language and what way they use words. The European Peace Facility, that's, as a recent report said, it's an unsecured gun on the EU table. The European Peace Facility is becoming the EU's main funding tool for military activities outside the EU. It's being used to support weapons deliveries abroad. And this was investigated by Investigate Europe, which pointed out that no other project stands as much for the EU's shift from a peace project to a military project and a military power of the European Peace Facility. Now, we could see this, and I'd written about it in the past and produced little booklets on the EU, the creation of a European military superstate, and that's what we have. But it gets even worse. And what I want to mention is in relation to the nuclear issue. Back many decades ago when we were campaigning on this, many minutes?
About 8 minutes left.
5 minutes, okay. There is a huge amount going on, first of all, in relation to issues we'd raised before. And one issue which I want to mention because it became, that's the issue of conscription. Now, we did mention that in the past. Now, nobody could say because most countries were getting rid of conscription, but because it still was on the books in most European countries, there was always a danger that this might happen. Now, if you look at the moment, at what's happening at the moment, the French President Emmanuel Macron has announced that France will increase the number of its. Oh no, sorry, that's on nuclear. I just wanted to mention on the conscription. Germany has actually introduced a new law in relation to conscription. France has done the same. A number of other EU countries that had actually dropped this are now moving back towards that. There is a very good, if I get it at the end, or I can answer some questions. There's a very good report. Not good, but interesting report from the European Parliament on conscription from last year, and I'll give you the details on that later on. But the one issue, before I finish, that I want to talk about is the issue of the nuclear deterrent. And before I go to that, I also want to mention that the spending within the European Union is being overseen by the European Defence Agency. And the European Defence Agency started off as a European armaments agency lobbying in the European institutions, and I was there at the time. And what they did was they lobbied to get an increase in investment in arms industries, bemoaning the fact, especially since the end of the Cold War, there was no, there was a slump in arms. We really need to do something to boost this up. So the European armaments industry agency in Thessalonica in 2004, I think it was, the EU summit. The European Armaments Agency was called then the European Defence Agency and incorporated into the EU treaties in Lisbon and given the role of actually deciding what member states will spend. So if you put the arms industry in charge of what will be spent, they're hardly going to say let's cut back on military spending. Of course they're not, and that's a key issue. And again, I can give you some details on that in any question and follow-up, but it's clear what the European Defence Agency is doing, and that is what's happening in relation to defence spending. Now, when I went into the European Parliament in 2004, I was on a number of committees. One was the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Security and Disarmament. And before that first term was out, that committee, which had been there for a long time, was changed its name to the Subcommittee on Security and Defence. And that's what it's been ever since. The disarmament went out the window, its defence is in, and that's what it's all about. Now, just on the nuclear, I really want to push on this, because the French President Macron announced that France will increase the number of nuclear warheads and allow temporary deployment of its nuclear-armed aircraft to 8 European countries to bolster the security of the continent. Now, France has been and Germany have been exploring this for quite some time. Germany and France have now found common ground on extending the French nuclear deterrent, so long as it's compatible, of course, with NATO, etc. And what they're doing is, this is an advancement of the deterrent, extending it. What they say, the new policy, Macron spoke of advanced deterrence, extending deep into Europe while retaining France's sole responsibility for any decision making. Finland, which was very much against the whole idea of nuclear weapons, has actually agreed that that France can deploy its nuclear weapons on its territory, completely against the law that it had originally had. And as I said, a number of other member states are doing this. So what we have now, and Germany and France are to the fore in this, and then there is also the agreement between between France and the UK in relation to the nuclear deterrent. So what they're doing is they're saying we can't really depend on America for the nuclear deterrent anymore. We also need to have our own, but of course it will still be in compatible with the American nuclear deterrent. And this is, in my opinion, going completely backwards in relation to our attitude towards nuclear weapons. And we're sitting here today while Iran and Israel while Israel and America are attacking Iran. And we all know that Israel has nuclear weapons, and America has used nuclear weapons, the only country on the planet to actually bomb, not once but twice, and get away with it, and nobody has really done anything about it. And Israel is well nuclear armed, and they're considering what they're doing and considering their attitude towards negotiations. We don't know what's going to happen.
5 minutes.
5 minutes left, have I? Oh, okay. So the nuclear issue is key, because we always argued that the whole idea of this European common defence policy would also have at its hands the nuclear capability. And now the thing in the idea in Europe is we need to push the nuclear weapons agenda. We need to expand the nuclear weapons agenda. We need to facilitate France and Germany and the UK, which isn't strictly speaking in the EU, but I mean, the UK can do damage whether it's inside or outside, and that's what it's doing. And the UK and France are cooperating on intensive negotiation and cooperation in relation to their nuclear weapons. And the key countries in Europe are, in Europe, as I say, as opposed to the EU, are the UK, France, and now Germany is also getting its finger on the button, and the other member states that are agreeing to this. Now, if we get rid of the triple lock, we don't know what the consequences there will be, also in relation to being involved in any kind of wars where there is also the nuclear capability. And we really need to think seriously about that. Now, I just wanted to mention a couple of other things before I finish off, and that is well, there's a surge in Europe in military spending within the EU, which I was going to touch on, but I think it speaks for itself. It has increased dramatically. And it's not surprising when you consider who's calling the shots. The industries that benefit from the arms expansion. And of course, the people who are suffering are all the people where these weapons are being exported to. And it doesn't matter whether it's Ukraine and Russia or where it is, they're still being used to kill human beings. And we're supporting that. And I think it's time, this is now time for Ireland to stand up for itself and say, no, we're not participating, we're going to pull back on the military aspects of the European Union. I mean, other member states in the European Union have taken a strong position on certain things, like Orban, for example, in relation to the Russian-Ukraine crisis. So if they could take a position, why can Ireland not take a position? Why can Ireland not stand up and be counted? How can Germany go over and kowtow to Trump after the serious breach of international law in relation to its attack on Iran and get away with it? And why are we not able to stand up for not what is wrong, but for what is right? And it's time the Irish government and this country stood up for that. And just in relation to the triple lock, it is very difficult to know what we're going to do, but one thing is for sure, we need to have some sort of position in relation to, first of all, the triple lock should stay, but also in relation to ensuring that we can get neutrality enshrined in the Constitution, or we could get, whether it be neutrality or whatever it is, we need to ensure that no future government can do what our government has done to date. And I do not trust our government in relation to when they say that we saw what they did on Nice. They lied to us. They made us vote for something that they knew they were going to pull back on at the end. They're now talking about, oh, well, look, this will be for peacekeeping. It's not. It's to allow the European Union to move ahead without any obstacles in relation to its military agenda. And all we're doing is facilitating that. And I think it's a huge slur on our reputation historically in relation to what we were doing for peace and disarmament. And we need as well to get the younger people involved in this, because they're the ones, the future generations, who are going to suffer as a result of what's being pushed. And we have to say no. We have to get all the political parties, and I hope that Eamon will persuade his colleagues in Fianna Fáil to back off on this and to leave the triple lock where it is, and in fact to go further and protect us further from the militarisation of Europe and also from being involved in illegal wars. Close Shannon off to any wars. Sanctions on those countries breaching international law. Sanctions just don't apply to the countries that they select, all of them. And we have to ensure that we respect international law ourselves. And we should be filing our complaint with the European Court in relation to what has happened over the last week.
It's my pleasure to have an opportunity to say a few words here. And I grew up in the generation when you might remember some of the great anti-war songs, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And many more of them. And I think that we need to reflect very seriously on Ireland's role in the world. I also believe always that in life it's better to light a candle than curse the dark. In other words, do what you can do, rather than say, if I don't achieve everything, I achieve nothing. The first one, Article 5, says Ireland is a sovereign, independent, democratic state. Article 29(1) says Ireland affirms its devotion to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation amongst nations founded on international justice and morality. Article 29(2), and this binds us all, Ireland affirms its adherence to the principle of the pacific settlement of international disputes by international arbitration or judicial determination. Article 29(3), Ireland accepts the generally recognised principles of international law as its rule of conduct in its relations with other states. Article 29(4)(4), Ireland affirms its commitment to the European Union within which the member states of that union work together to promote peace, shared values as well as and the well-being of their people. Article 29(4)(9), which was added as part of Nice 2, so Nice 1 and Nice 2 weren't actually the exact same referendum. The state shall not adopt the decision taken by the European Council to establish a common defence pursuant to Article 42 of the Treaty on the European Union, where that common defence would include the state. So we actually can't, if they have a formal common defence, we're locked out, thankfully. Article 42 of the Treaty of the European Union, so what is this Article 42? Establishes the framework for the EU Common Security and Defence Policy. Key to this Article 42(7), the Mutual Assistance Clause, which mandates that if a EU member state is the victim of armed aggression on its territory, other member states must provide aid and assistance by all means in their power. Part of the context of this is that it is part of the broader common security and defence policy, which aims to provide the EU with operational capabilities of peacekeeping, conflict prevention and strengthening international security. Now, invocation of Article 2(7) has been invoked once by the French in November 2015, so the idea that this will never happen, it already has happened, following the Paris terrorist attacks. Now, I believe it's absolutely imperative and constitutionally imperative. It's clearly laid down. It's the people's law, can only be changed by the people. I believe it's imperative in order for Ireland to adhere to its constitutional obligations that it pursues an independent foreign and military policy at the UN and at meetings of the EU. This is possible. And we see many of the larger EU countries acting unilaterally on foreign and defence policy when the case suits them. Already it is constitutionally forbidden for Ireland to join a mandatory EU defence pact. And my view is that it's against the spirit of the Constitution, if not the letter of the law, to become a part of any common defence arrangements voluntary on a case-by-case basis. An example of this is the so-called coalition of the willing. So the question arises, what policies should we adopt and how can we be proactive on the international stage in line with our Constitution? Now, the first obligation is to defend our state. But when we go to defend the state, let's follow ordinary human principles. One of the most important protections that we have, whether it is personal or a country, is to create a situation that nobody is out to harm you or to kill you. Unknowingly, we all apply this principle in our everyday lives, as we largely avoid situations of potential danger, and we try to create a society that is relatively safe. I was looking at the statistics in the last 24 hours of homicide in various countries. We're very low down on the list. So I can say with certainty that Ireland is a relatively safe country in day-to-day, with a largely unarmed police force and a public, few of whom carry personal weapons. So we don't go around with a revolver in our pocket. Very few of us spend significant money on day-to-day personal security. In other societies, despite high expenditure on personal security, and many people carrying personal weapons, there's a much higher risk to life or rate of homicide. Similar to personal security, the first basis of security for a country is not to threaten any other country, and not to be seen as to being aligned militarily with countries with overseas interests that appear to pose a threat. In other words, to avoid situations that by association you get drawn into wider worldwide conflagrations. We've seen a perfect example of this in the last week. The US/Israel versus Iran conflict, in which UK got drawn in the first week when their base in Cyprus was attacked. And where now the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, is saber-rattling on behalf of NATO against Iran as part of a domino effect. So we could see immediately that if you're any way associated with this club, something in a far-off land can immediately embroil everybody. And if nobody believes that, just look back at the origins of the First World War. In the Irish case, we are better off trying to ensure that we stay apart from alliances that have as members countries such as the USA, France and the UK, which have your overseas bases in many parts of the globe protecting their interests. So if any of you Google it, I Googled it, I have it all there in my bag. All the foreign bases that the British military have and the French military have, I think actually the French have even more around the world. So France is not the country we see on the map when it comes to these affairs, and I think that that's important. And many of these bases, in the case of France and the UK, are remnants of their imperial past. In our case, our first object should be not to get drawn in by association into conflict. Secondly, we should, through our embassy network, and I'm very, very strong on this, and through foreign embassies accredited to Ireland, stress our policy of military neutrality and our constitutional values of the adherence to international law and pacific resolution of international disputes. Irrespective of our differences with various countries, we should keep strong diplomatic ties with them all, and in a polite but forceful way, diplomatically outline our views and values to them, and impressing them that there is no reason to attack us or our infrastructure, as we will do no harm to them and we have no ill intent. And that in the event of attack, we will stand our ground and we will take that in the most appropriate way at the time. So the first defence is diplomacy. And that's what kept us out of the Second World War. And I was looking at the very beginning of the Second World War. There was a key meeting that made neutrality possible. And it was interesting. It was with Hempel, the German ambassador. And De Valera met him. And he explained to him that there'd have to be some consideration for Britain in terms of the fact that we were very dependent on them economically for coal and so on. And he got his understanding that he wasn't going to red flag it to Berlin. So diplomacy is a very, very powerful tool that's often overlooked.
You have 10 more minutes.
There should be reasonable and detailed assessment of our risks to our sovereignty and to strengthen our resilience, including reasonable and focused investment in our defence forces. I have no problem with that. Now, the first challenge in our defence forces, we should pay them properly. The second thing is we need to do more in drug interdiction because we have a major travel challenge in this island. It's overrun with illicit drugs. In relation to marine infrastructure, I'm totally unclear as to what's our sovereign rights, what's our sovereign powers, and what's our sovereign responsibilities. My understanding is that we have 12 miles of sovereign waters that are ours and ours only. And we control those in every way as part of our national territory as much as the land is. By my understanding that the economic zone, you could only stop on very limited grounds, for example, environment and so on. So this talk of shadow fleets and all the rest, or exercises by foreign military, and I checked this out by a parliamentary question when I was a TD, as to what powers and countries or collections of countries that had military exercises in the economic zone. And it was mainly EU countries, and Russia had the famous one when the fishermen stopped them. They were great fishermen. We have also in our waters fishing rights, gas pipes, electricity connectors and so on. So we have to examine those. But we have to examine them in real world, and again, not like the scare world that's going on. Unfortunately, I have to say, with the fishing rights back to 1973, we've given them away anyway. So there's nothing much to defend. The question in relation to telecommunications, I think, was covered fairly well earlier on. I think we need to know what's our absolute responsibility for these cables, because we didn't put them there. And the second thing, where have we actually got a power? And the third thing, of course, is if you really want to get the cable, you could go out into the open beyond the 200 miles. So, And the other thing is, I think it's much more likely to get the cables get attacked by cyber attack. I don't think they cut the cable at all. I think they go the cyber way. In the air, I've nothing against getting primary radar. I'd love to get it because I'd love to find out authoritatively, for once and for all, is anybody overflying us, other than with permission? And who's getting the permissions to overfly us? Funny enough, my belief is that from outside the state, the greatest threat is that countries who participate directly or indirectly in the Iran war could be subject to what they term terrorist attacks. Now remember, one person's terrorist attack is a freedom fight for another person, and I think, if you get the hell bombed out of you, there will be a temptation to fight back in your own way. And again, I think that's something we have to try, as far as possible, insulate ourselves from, and again, we're back to diplomacy. Another issue of concern to me that very rarely gets raised in this debate is the issue of the 6 counties that are controlled by the United Kingdom. And at the very least, we should look, at the moment my understanding is they only have territorial army bases there effectively. But they could put missiles in, they could put nuclear weapons in, they could do anything they want. I think we should look for an assurance from the British government that they would not move on anything in the north without the consent of the Irish government, openly given. One point is, they say you're a fool, you're leaving yourself open. I think it's fair to say, if we look at 9/11, the assassination of US presidents, the drones, if they existed around the closed Brussels airport, the blowing up of Nord Stream, these are all done in highly militarized zones, in highly defended zones, and still there was no defense. The Pentagon got effectively bombed, the center of the whole power in the United States. So let us just not delude ourselves that there's any alternative to our policy of a hierarchy of peaceful settlement of international disputes. Neutrality as outlined, diplomacy and reasonable defence as the last option on the list. The opposite is really the truth. That is the best way forward. Give me the good 10 minutes. I have only 2 pages left. Ireland over the decades has a proud record. So what can we do? Let's be positive now. I've told you how we minimise the risk to us. Now, what should we be doing on the big world? And we have been very active through the League of Nations in the 30s and in the United Nations, particularly in the 60s, in supporting international law and promoting peace through, for example, the lead we gave in nuclear non-proliferation and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I think it's fair to say that with Frank Aiken, nearly singularly from the very beginning, promoted that, and in 10 years, he was the first signatory on that treaty. We should once again become a vocal voice in the United Nations based on morality and justice and our Constitution. We should seek support for changes in the outdated structures of the UN itself, which go back 80 years to the post-Second World War. So India is not there at the same level as France and Britain, have two votes. India and Indonesia and these massive countries aren't in there. So the whole thing needs a shake-up, and I think we should go to the smaller and all the other countries, the excluded countries of the world, and say, we can't have 5 imperial powers from the Second World War dictating the pace for the world. There's a need for the UN to have a mechanism to give an independent view as to whether the actions of a nation in war were legal or not. There has to be some process that defines at UN level whether an action is legal or not, if somebody says there's an imminent threat of attack. We must tackle the arms race that's already been mentioned here today and seek to reduce the arms produced in the developed world, many of which are used in the third world. If the money that was spent on arms was spent on economic development and global development, the world would be a better place. In relation to the EU, Ireland must oppose recent moves to deregulate how arms are produced and sold, creating a dangerous precedent for global security. So there's a positive, as been outlined already. There's a positive effort in the European Union to promote the arms industry as if we were promoting making sweets. Ireland should also oppose all EU budgetary aid to the arms industry. So any money we give to the European Union, and I think it comes as a surprise to many Irish people to think that the hard-earned tax dollars are going to the European Union for military purposes and for the promotion of arms and the sale of arms worldwide. And we should also go further and make it clear that we will not fund arms production from our large contribution to the European Union budget. Now, we net contribute to the European budget about 2 billion a year. In other words, we put in 3 to 4 billion and we get much less money back. So we're not a state that's the handout, it's the opposite way around now. I've also noticed that 5 EU countries, and this just shows you the direction of travel, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Poland and Estonia, have announced their intention to withdraw from the Ottawa Convention against the production and the placing of landmines. Landmines mainly kill and maim civilians and were banned for that reason. Again, we should be vocal in the UN and in the EU in our opposition to this and to countries leaving the Ottawa Convention. Ireland should not get involved in military missions not related to humanitarian relief, natural disaster or rescue, unless a natural disaster or rescue, in other words, if there was a natural disaster, I think it's fair to go immediately. Humanitarian relief, we already did that during the Second World War when the fire brigades were sent to Belfast at 1 hour's notice. So I think nobody ever argues in those kind of circumstances, unless there's a UN mandate going with it. Now, I noticed in the 2025 Defence Bill, in Head 6, you know the way you get the heads of a bill, it states that Ireland will only participate in an international force if it acts in accordance with the principle of the United Nations Charter and in accordance with the principles of justice and international law. So they're actually saying they're laying down good principles. Where the flaw is, of course, they're not saying how you define whether you're doing the thing according to EU law. So, in my view, they're speaking out of two sides of the mouth. They're saying it'll be according to the UN Charter, but we're not going to get the UN Charter to validate that. Now, it's a basic rule that if you have a law laid down, there's some way of validating that law. And then the only people who can validate the law of the United Nations and the Charter of the United Nations is the United Nations itself. The United Nations have no power to tell us to go anywhere. They have at the moment the power to say, don't get involved in a peace project if we don't endorse it. Of course, what is, in my view, really happening here by easy steps is an attempt to go down the same route to actually get into a common defence by easy steps. And I think we have to see the direction of travel, and it's easy does it until you suddenly wake up one day and they say, well, the last step's not too bad, you took all the other steps with us, and don't worry about the last step in the process. So we need a process of validation. And one of the big arguments with this bill is to say, okay, we agree, it should be according to the UN Charter. Now, how are you going to validate that? Because I think that that's very important. And then you turn around and say, therefore, the triple lock should remain as the third leg on the stool and the independent validation of our foreign military actions. In other words, instead of further weakening the UN, which is weak enough as it is, we should be reforming it and strengthening it. So finally, there's going to be plenty of people out there, I can see them all, the Dan O'Briens and the rest. They say that I'm an idealistic dreamer and not living in the real world. And in response, I'll quote the words of P.H. Pierce. Since the wise men have not spoken, I speak them that I'm only a fool that has loved this folly, yea, more than the wise men their books or their counting houses or their quiet homes. O wise men, riddle me this. What if the dream comes true? What if the dream comes true, and if millions unborn shall dwell in the house that I've shaped in my heart, the noble house of my thought? Good morning.